this is great for me because I think last year my first lunch and learn that I did, I believe, was also right before Hanukkah, or right around Hanukkah, and now again this year we're right around Hanukkah. So take the opportunity to do a little bit of learning around Hanukkah. And I think last year when we met, though I don't know if anyone here was there for that session. I mean, Rachel was.
I was.
Oh, okay, and Phyllis was. So last year we talked really about the oil and the miracle of the oil and sort of where that comes from. For today, I have, again, we'll be talking about the Hanukkah miracle, but sort of from a different angle. Rachel, if you can enable screen sharing for me.
So I am making you the co-host.
Okay, perfect.
So now you can share the screen.
Fantastic. So we're looking at Hanukkah, which some of you might know, Hanukkah is different in a number of ways from any other holiday that we have in Judaism, or at least of the major holidays. Because for one thing, Hanukkah does not appear in the Torah, doesn't appear in the Hebrew Bible. It came too late. So every other holiday, we think of the big ones, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Passover, Shavuot, those are all biblical holidays that are in the Torah. And then you get a holiday like Purim, which is not in the Torah, but it's later in the Bible. Hanukkah doesn't make it into the Bible. So that's one way in which it's, sort of clearly different. And I guess sort of along with that, most holidays, for people who are into Talmud study, it seems like Peter and Annie are enjoy Talmud study. Most holidays have like a book of the Talmud, a tractate of the Talmud that is focused on that holiday. So there's a tractate of Rosh Hashanah. There's a tractate for Yoma is Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Psachim is Passover, Megillah is basically about Purim, and Shabbat is Hanukkah is an exception in that it appears very, very briefly in the Talmud, in Tractate Shabbat. That's why I said Shabbat just now. I'm seeing Shabbat on my screen. It appears very briefly, and more than that, when it appears, the Talmud starts its conversation about Hanukkah by asking, "My Hanukkah, what's Hanukkah?" So even the rabbis of the Talmud seem to understand that there is this thing called Hanukkah, but as opposed to the other holidays where no one's asking what is it, it's sort of, we know what Rosh Hashanah is, we know what Yom Kippur is. There's like, what's Hanukkah? This is, by the way, comes in a conversation about candles and what happens if you light candles and it causes a fire, and they say, well, it's different with Shabbat candles and Hanukkah candles, and they say, Hanukkah candles, what's Hanukkah? And then that begins sort of a little bit of exploration, but not long, like a couple pages in the Talmud, that's it, focused on Hanukkah. And we'll get into why that is, that the rabbis are not so comfortable with Hanukkah. So, and by the way, my style generally is like conversational. So if, anything to chime in or question or, especially, we're a nice small group today. So feel free to ask anything as we go on. It's not going to be such like a frontal presentation. But I'll start with this very brief summary that the Talmud gives about Hanukkah. So it says, what is Hanukkah? My Hanukkah. It says that our sages taught on the 25th of Kislev. Kislev is the month that we're in right now. That we still have another, I guess, week. Yeah, basically another week until, a little over a week and a half until Hanukkah. On the 25th of Kislev, the days of Hanukkah, they are 8, not to eulogize on them or fast on them. So that's what we know. There's 8 days, and on these 8 days, if you have, they're sort of celebratory days. You can't fast, you can't give eulogies if there was a funeral. They're sort of these happy days. It says, so what are these days? That when the Greeks entered the temple, they polluted all the oils in the temple And when the Hasmonean dynasty overcame and defeated them, they checked and they found but one cruse of oil that was set in place with the seal of the high priest. But there was in it only enough to light a single day. A miracle was done with it, and they lit from it for 8 days. The following year, the sages fixed those days, making them holidays for praise and thanksgiving. Okay? The famous story of the miracle of the oil. Now, there's one problem, one, I would say, big problem, which is that we never really heard about this miracle of oil before. I mentioned that the Hanukkah story isn't in the Hebrew Bible, in the Tanakh. There are the books of Maccabees, which I think are part of the Christian, or they're part of the Protestant Bible, but not the Catholic Bible and not the Jewish Bible. But they basically tell the Hanukkah story. They don't make it into our Bible. And as we'll see, they never mention this miracle of oil. It's not to say that it didn't happen, but it was seemingly new, a new appearance. We only see this mention of a miracle one time previously in a source that's about contemporary with the Talmud that mentions a miracle of oil lasting for 8 days, right? The famous miracle of Hanukkah. It doesn't appear anywhere before that it's not something that we see anywhere. Which raises questions about, why this is the miracle that the Talmud is focused on. It seemed like the miracle of Hanukkah was a military victory. We fought against the Greeks. The Greeks wanted to destroy our way of life. They polluted all the oils in the temple, and so forth. And we beat them, we won, we're celebrating. That seemed to be what everyone understood the miracle of Hanukkah to be. Until we get to the Talmud that suddenly says, no, the miracle is not that we won this military victory. It's really a miracle of oil that lasted for 8 days.
So was the story kind of introduced and made more public, for lack of a better word, when they felt that this was needed? Was their faith lacking in the community, and they felt like they needed to introduce the story of the miracle to bring people back into the faith?
So that's the great question that I'm interested in hearing other people's thoughts also of why do you think, the Talmud is choosing to focus on this miracle, a miracle of oil, of God's involvement, rather than a miracle of, the little engine that could, this little Israelite group defeating the mighty Greek army. Like, why change the focus of the holiday?
Good question.
Yeah.
I have a question, if I may.
Yeah.
Is there any reason to believe that they didn't extinguish the flame each evening, and that's how it extended for 8 days?
Well, the idea was that the oil...
I know, but is it not... It lasted for 8 days, but is there any reason to believe they didn't extinguish it at sundown and ignite it in the morning again, and that's how it lasted 8 days?
Well, so in the temple before, they would light the candle at night, and it would be lit from nighttime until the morning time.
So that's going on.
Which I think is the same as the Hanukkah candles, that it was lit at night and stayed lit until the morning. But yeah, I mean, I think that it would have been extinguished in the morning. Now I'm trying to remember, because that commandment comes from the Torah about lighting the candles. I'm trying to remember if someone else comes and lights another candle in the morning, or if it's just lit at night. But the idea is that it would stay lit for the duration of the night at least, and maybe for the day as well. Whether it's lit during, I think it stays lit during the day as well, but I would have to check on that. But either way, it seemed like it was just, according to this, a little bit of oil, and then, that oil that didn't seem like it was enough ended up being enough for 8 days. Presumably enough time for them to get to make more pure oil and be able to light the menorah without that problem anymore. Right. I heard someone else was chiming in before as well about this question about why we think that this is the miracle that we're focusing on. Any
Yeah.
other ideas?
I was curious why it was 8 days. So you just explained that though, that it was 8 days because that's how long it took them to come up with the purified oil that they needed for the temple. But
Ye-
I was curious always, why 8 days? Why not 10? Why not 7? Why not 2?
Yeah. Well, so that's a great question. And another piece of that is that, sort of the biggest holiday on the Jewish calendar, which we don't typically think of as the biggest holiday, but in temple times definitely was the biggest holiday, is the holiday of Sukkot. Even Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which we think of as the high holy days, the really big ones, are really just preparatory days for Sukkot. Sukkot is the day, which is an 8-day holiday, and that's the time when everyone would come to the temple. It was the big harvest festival, right? It's sort of the Jewish Thanksgiving, and everyone would come and sort of bring their harvest before God. And like in the Talmud, Sukkot is known as Hachag, the holiday. So that was sort of the big event. Passover was a big deal too. Shavuot was a big deal too. Those are the other temple holidays, but Sukkot was the biggest one. And Sukkot is 8 days. And during the time when the temple was under Greek control, they weren't able to celebrate Sukkot. And so actually in the Book of Maccabees, it talks about how essentially when they rededicated the temple, they held a sort of modified Sukkot because they weren't able to celebrate Sukkot in its proper time, a couple months earlier. So that's the other. In addition to being able to get more oil, that idea of 8 days really comes from that connection with Sukkot.
Makes sense. Okay, well, that answered that. Yeah, that answered that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any other thoughts on that question?
A big holiday or something at that time of year, since there was nothing and they wanted to keep people's attention to the religion and celebrating together. And
yeah, well, that too, right? I think it's a time of year, it's the darkest time of year, right? It's a time when there's not really a lot of holidays. We have a lot of holidays earlier, and then we get into a time of year that's particularly dark. So I think not coincidental that we focus on oil and light. Lots of religions have some kind of festival related to light around the time of the winter solstice when it's the darkest of the year. So that could be as well that there's a connection with light because it's so dark out at this time.
How do you get around to making a present daily out of that deal?
Making a what?
Giving gifts one day, each day a gift.
Where does that come from?
Yeah.
You're saying? I think that just comes from Christmas. I think that's yeah, that's a new phenomenon. I think that's really purely a Christmas thing.
That's cool.
Yeah.
It's prevalent, but I think there might have been something about giving books, back in the day, but yeah, the presents is a new thing.
But basically, we just started celebrating these holidays so much in the last 10, 15 years.
Hanukkah, you're saying?
Yeah.
I think the way in which Hanukkah sort of became like really a major Jewish holiday is largely connected to being in America and Christmas. It was a holiday. It was observed widely, for going back to the times of the temple, of the Second Temple at least. But in terms of being seen as really a major holiday and the presents and all of that stuff, that's really, I think, largely a 20th century American, not just American, but a 20th century phenomenon related to Christmas. Maybe it goes back a little bit earlier, but not.
To have the children relate to a specific Jewish holiday rather than the Gentile Christmas.
Exactly. So they don't feel like they're missing out. It's like, no, you get a holiday too with its own heroes and its own presents.
And they would give out Hanukkah gelt. So that's what they gave as a present when I was a kid.
Yeah.
Hanukkah gelt. Yeah. And, in certain pieces, dreidel goes back, again, not super far, but a couple hundred years. There's an idea of Hanukkah gelt and people playing dreidel. There's like things that go back a little bit of time, but the observance really seemed to be primarily focused on lighting candles, going back at least to Talmudic times. Gift seems to be a much newer thing. But they're happy days. They're days of praise and Thanksgiving, right? It's celebratory. But at the same time, it wasn't really a holiday. Lots of the restrictions that we have around holidays, like, for people who, let's say, are Orthodox or conservative, who, follow halacha, it's understood as Jewish law, like you don't drive a car on a holiday, you don't light candles, you don't use electricity, all these kinds of things. Hanukkah is an exception. None of those restrictions are in place on Hanukkah. You can drive your car, you can cook, you can do all those kinds of things. So it's a very different kind of.
Go up in an elevator.
You can go. You said an elevator?
Yeah.
You can go in an elevator. You can, yeah.
In New York, with all the religious, it moved up into big, tall houses, and they wouldn't go into an elevator until they set up a Shabbos elevator.
Yeah.
Where you didn't have to, it stopped on every floor. You didn't have to touch the floor.
Yes.
So.
Yes, right. So they have Shabbos elevators in certain areas in New York and also in Israel, because people who don't use electricity on Shabbat can't press the button for the elevator. And so in buildings that have a lot of Jewish residents, big apartment buildings, they'll have an elevator that stops on every floor and opens and kind of waits. So it goes very slowly, but as a way to use an elevator.
Yeah.
But again, on Hanukkah, none of that applies. You can do whatever you want on Hanukkah. I want to get in a little bit, though, to this question of discomfort. Less a focus on why we use and focus on this miracle of the oil, and more the focus on why we don't focus on the military victory. For me growing up, this was often a conversation, in Hebrew school of, there's two miracles of Hanukkah. There's the military miracle and there's the oil miracle. And the way it was usually presented was something along the lines of, we don't want to be focused on, on might, on power, on these kinds of things. So it's, a miracle of oil, of something from God that's purely good and, it doesn't have a negative side attached to it, is better than focusing on, a military might. That was how I was raised. I don't know if other people had a similar experience or even, focus on the military miracle. But
I definitely learned about that growing up in Hebrew school. I mean, we would celebrate the Maccabees and dress up, and there was this sense of power and pride of how this little Jewish band had defeated this massive army. I mean, I think we definitely celebrated that when I was young.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, and Judah Maccabee, right? So there is a focus on that, but there's sort of a hidden secret of the military victory, which we don't like to focus on. And I'll bring in here, this is actually a source, the Baal HaMaor is like a rabbinic commentary, but he raises a question, which is a really important and kind of problematic question. Talking about Hanukkah, he asks a question, how could the holy items in the temple have become impure through a non-Jew? We have a principle that a person cannot render unfit for use items which are not theirs. So it says this is a general principle in Jewish law, that you can't make something impure if it doesn't belong to you. You can only impurify something that's yours. And he said the oil in the temple was, belonged to the Jews. So how could the Greeks, I mean, if they used it, that's one thing, but how could they have impurified the oil without using it? If it was still in containers, how could they make it impure? It wasn't theirs. right? And he responds to his own questions, saying, the holy items in the temple, like the stones of the altar and the silver and gold of Jerusalem, could have certainly become impure through a Jew, as they are considered children of the Most High, but through a non-Jewish idolater, which what the Greeks were, the worshipped idols, who is not considered a child of the Most High, they could not have been made impure. Therefore, it is necessary to say that through corrupt Jews, the items in the temple were deconsecrated. So this is the interpretation that I have learned from my teachers. And this goes along with what we read in the Book of Maccabees, is sort of the dark secret of Hanukkah, is that Hanukkah wasn't actually a war between the Jews and the Greeks. It was a war between Jews and Jews. It was a civil war between Jews who wanted to observe the Greek way of life and the Jews like the Maccabees who wanted to continue to follow the religion of their ancestors, to continue to worship, to worship God. And again, we see this explicitly in the Book of Maccabees, which, as I mentioned, it's not part of the Jewish Bible, though it's contemporaneous with the later books of the Hebrew Bible. So it didn't make it into the Tanakh, into our Bible, but it did make it into the Old Testament. Again, I think it's the Protestant Bible includes the Book of Maccabees in the Old Testament, so to speak. I think the Catholic Bible doesn't. I don't know why that is. But anyway, the Book of Maccabees, which is before the Common Era, goes back to I think the 4th century before the Common Era, tells us the story, and it says, it was then that there emerged from Israel, right, Jews, a set of renegades who led many people astray. Come, they said, let us ally ourselves with the Gentiles surrounding us, for since we separated ourselves from them, many misfortunes have overtaken us. This proposal proved acceptable, and a number of the people eagerly approached the king, who authorized them to practice the Gentiles' observances. So these Jews went to the Greek ruler and said, we were asking permission to practice like you do, right? The Greek way of life was it was a live and let live. Every nation, every people that we conquer can continue to practice their own practices, the practices of their ancestors. And this group of Jews goes to the king and says, hey, please, can we do what the Greeks do? And the Greek ruler said, sure, that's fine with me, but he wasn't forcing it on anybody. So it says, so they built a gymnasium in Jerusalem, such as the Gentiles have. They ceased practicing circumcision and abandoned the Holy Covenant, selling out themselves and their traditions to become like the Greeks around them. Okay, so that's the first part of the story. Again, purely coming from Jews who want to be like Greeks. Now, once they do that, and it sort of, takes on, now the Greeks are, their focus is on maintaining sort of a sense of order. So it's once the Jews decided that they want to be like Greeks, that's fine, but now they all have to be like Greeks. We're not going to have multiple different groups with different practices within a certain, nation state. So, okay, the people in this area of Judea now practice like the Greeks do. They, have gymnasiums, they do all these things. And so it says the king's commissioners, this is now the next chapter, chapter 2. And the king's commissioners who were enforcing the apostasy is like the, heresy, came to the town of Modi'in, still a town in Israel today, for the sacrifices. So they said, okay, everyone's going to sacrifice now to these idols. Many Israelites gathered around them, but Mattathias and his sons drew apart. The king's commissioners then addressed Mattathias as follows. He said, you are a respected leader, a great man in this town. You have sons and brothers to support you. Be the first to step forward and conform to the king's decree, as all the nations have done. And the leaders of Judah and the survivors in Jerusalem, you and your sons shall be reckoned among the friends of the king. You and your sons will be honored with gold and silver and many presents. So he said, Mattathias, everyone knows that you're this big leader in town. If you come and bring these sacrifices to the Greek gods, then we know that everyone will be on the same page. They'll say, oh, even Mattathias is on board with this. and we Greece was only worried about maintaining the peace. So as long as there weren't internal struggles, they were fine. So it's like, this is what everyone else is doing. All the Jews are now practicing Greek ways. We need you to do it as well. Now, verse 19, raising his voice, Mattathias retorted, even if every nation living in the king's dominions obeys him, each forsaking its ancestral religion to conform to his decrees, I, my sons and my brothers, will still follow the covenant of our ancestors. May heaven preserve us from forsaking the law and its observances. As for the king's orders, we will not follow them. We shall not swerve from our own religion, either to the right or to the left. As he finished speaking, a Jew came forward in the sight of all to offer sacrifice on this altar in Modi'im as the royal edict required. And when Mattathias saw this, he became infuriated. Shaking with rage, he threw himself on the man and slaughtered him on the altar. At the same time, he killed the king's commissioner who was there to enforce the sacrifice and tore down the altar. In his zeal for the law, he acted as Pinchas had against Zimri, son of Salu. That's the story in the Book of Numbers, which I have below. I'll put it up there so you can see it in a moment. Then Mattathias went through the town, shouting at the top of his voice, let everyone who has any zeal for the law and takes his stand on the covenant come out and follow me. Then he fled with his sons into the hills, leaving all their possessions behind in the town. So this is how the Battle of Hanukkah starts. And again, it's really initiated by Jews. And the war, we teach it to our kids as, the Greeks wanted the Jews to stop practicing Judaism. It really wasn't the case. It was really Hellenized Jews who wanted this and appealed to the king for permission for everyone to act like the Hellenized Jews, to practice Greek ways. And Mattathias was the outlier who said, no, I'm not doing it. And he started a civil war against his own, co-religionists, these other Jews. Now, is this a story that anyone has heard before?
No.
No. Again, the Book of Maccabees is not part of the Bible, largely because the rabbis don't really like it. The rabbis of the Talmud, the later rabbis who decide what becomes canon and what doesn't, didn't love the Book of Maccabees, and because they didn't love Mattathias and his descendants, they sort of had their issues with them. So they don't love that Book of Maccabees, but the core story is sort of clear to all of them. That really what the story of Hanukkah is the story of Jew against Jew. Let's call them Jewish Jews versus Hellenized Jews. And in spite of the fact that most Jews were fine practicing Greek religion, this small group started a rebellion and said, no, we're not going to do it, and eventually was able to get enough people on board with them that, the Greeks basically gave up and said, fine, we're leaving, you guys can, you can take control and go back to the way things used to be. Now, does this story change your way of looking at Hanukkah at all?
Definitely.
I'm not giving any more presents.
No more presents. Yeah, presents is an interesting
Yeah, when you know the history, the whole present thing seems a little out of kilter.
Let you give bullets.
Maybe we should give right. So maybe we should give bullets because of the military might. And I think it also, to me, is sort of makes it easier to understand why Hanukkah is different than other holidays where we, Purim is also kind of a military victory story. We defeat Haman and we defeat the Persians who, right? And there we shy away from it less. Hanukkah is purely a military victory and we don't focus on it. But again, I think a big part of that is that we weren't facing an outside oppressor. We were really facing a internal, people from within who wanted to kind of quench the fire of our faith.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, was someone about to comment?
No, I'm just wondering now, like, where else what other things happened that were covered up like this, that weren't really talked about in the Bible. Fleeing in the desert for 40 years, there was that whole story was about people who were worshiping idols, and so they do talk about it a bit in the Bible, but it's interesting to think about what other stories were covered up like that and altered to make it more palatable for us.
Yeah, no, it definitely is interesting. And I brought here, you're mentioning that this is sort of a common refrain. I have here from the Book of Numbers, the story of Pinchas, which is referenced in the Book of Maccabees, which is a story about, Jews sort of profaning themselves by whoring with Moabite women, and sort of they get attracted to these women, and then the women say, oh, come worship our gods, and they went and worshiped their gods, and a plague then comes down, and this person Pinchas, when he sees this Israelite man consorting with a Moabite woman, he takes a spear and shish kebabs them. He stabs them through their belly, right? So that's sort of a very parallel kind of story. And by the way, Pinchas, for doing that, him and his descendants get the priesthood. People who are Kohanim, who were the priests back in temple times, and nowadays they're not priests anymore, but Kohanim still get like the first aliyah in the Torah service, and they still have certain privileges, but they get that role because of Pinchas's similar zealotry, for God, his willingness to kill members of his own people who were doing things that were kind of against God, sort of spreading idolatry in the camp. So,
I have a slightly off-topic question.
Yeah.
Is today's experience seems
Yes.
to me like actually a Talmud study? Would that be fair to say what we're experiencing right now?
Like Talmud study, you said?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's what it seems like to me. Is that what you would categorize today?
So we're starting with the Talmud and definitely looking at the ways that the rabbis interpreted things. So in that way, it's, it's like Talmud study where I have the Talmud as a source, and we'll come back to the Talmud in a moment. Usually when I teach Talmud, I'm teaching, just sort of that text. This, I would say, is more just exploring the way that Hanukkah develops. Now, one of the challenges of Hanukkah, though, is that it doesn't appear in the Torah, right? So when we're thinking about learning the story of Hanukkah, what's the starting point? We have this Book of Maccabees, which is not part of the Bible, but is sort of a primary source. But if you notice in the Talmud, it never mentions, I only brought a little bit, but the Talmud in its section on Hanukkah never mentions the Book of Maccabees, and never really mentions the stories within it, because they were aware of this book, they knew the book, but they didn't want to glorify Mattathias and his descendants, who kind of became rivals later on. So, come for Talmud study later, and you'll see how similar it is or different.
4 o'clock.
Was that 4 o'clock? Yeah,
Okay.
4 o'clock. You send me. Make sure you get the link to for that.
Okay.
Okay, so I just want to go on because the Book of Maccabees does also tell the story of the dedication of the temple, and I'm not going to read the whole thing inside, but maybe we'll go to sort of midway down where it says they made new holy vessels, right? So they also rebuilt the sanctuary. This is after they found that everything was destroyed. They rebuilt the sanctuary, the interior of the temple, and they consecrated the courts. They made new holy vessels and brought the lampstand and the altar of incense and the table into the temple. These were kind of the core temple vessels. And they offered incense on the altar and lit the lamps in the lampstand and these gave light in the temple. Then they placed the bread on the table and hung up the curtain. So they basically found the temple that was not destroyed per se, but that was defiled. And so they did everything to try to bring it back to the way it should be. Thus, they finished all the work they had undertaken. And now, early in the morning on the 25th day of the 9th month, which is the month of Kislev, in the 148th year, I'm trying to figure, I think that's 148 years from the dedication of the first temple, of Solomon's temple. They rose and offered sacrifice, as the law directs, on the new altar of burnt offerings that they had built. At the very season and on the very day that the Gentiles had profaned it, it was dedicated with songs and harps and lutes and cymbals. All the people fell on their faces and wished and blessed heaven who had prospered them. Even just that blessing heaven rather than blessing God is kind of interesting. So we read about the 25th day, which is the first day of Hanukkah, them having the celebration. Notice, though, there's something missing, which is a miracle of oil, right? We read that they lit the candles, but there's no mention of a miracle here. The miracle is just that they were able to, fix up the temple, that God allowed them to defeat the Hellenized Jews, and that they were able to do all of this. Right? Oil doesn't come into the picture at all. With that being said, though, the idea of oil and the idea of light touches on something deeper, because the oil of the Hanukkah story isn't just a sort of a made-up miracle. I think there's a deeper meaning behind it. This is what when I taught last year for the Lunch and Learn, I talked a little bit about the symbolism of the oil, and that actually comes, this idea of the symbolism of the oil, I'm not going to say comes from, but is stated, I would say, fairly clearly in the book of Zechariah, which we read on Hanukkah. Because Hanukkah doesn't appear in the Bible, we don't have any story of Hanukkah to read in synagogue on Hanukkah. So what we do on the Shabbat of Hanukkah, the Haftarah, the section of the prophets that we read, is from the book of Zechariah, which is not about Hanukkah, but touches on the themes of Hanukkah. And so in this book, the prophet Zechariah says, as part of his prophecy, he said, "The angel who talked with me came back and woke me as a man is wakened from sleep. He said to me, 'What do you see?' And I answered, 'I see a lampstand, I see a menorah, all of gold with a bowl above it.'" This was like in his dream. Most prophecy, by the way, in the Hebrew Bible is in dreams. It's not like that people see something right in front of them while they're awake. It says the lamps on it are 7 in number, and the lamps above it have 7 pipes. So we have a 7-branched menorah that Zechariah sees in his dream. And by it are 2 olive trees, one on the right of the bowl and one on its left. I in turn asked the angel who talked with me, "What do these things mean, my Lord?" And the angel responded, "Do you not know what those things mean?" And I said, "No, my Lord." Then he explained to me as follows: "This is the word of the Lord to Zerubbabel. Not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, said the Lord of hosts," which became a song that some people might, a Debbie Friedman song of not by might and not by power. But this idea, which sort of becomes the main theme of Hanukkah, is this idea of not by might nor by power, but by my spirit. That the miracle of Hanukkah isn't about might and power. It's not about how Judah Maccabee was so strong and mighty, and him and his brothers and his father defeated the Greek army. It's about God. It's that God allowed for this miraculous event to take place. And as this prophecy sort of makes clear, this idea of God's spirit is connected deeply with an idea of lights, of menorah. If we even think about the menorah in the temple, right? We talked about how it's lit from the evening till the morning. The question is why? Like God, if God dwells in the temple, God doesn't need lights. God can see without light. But each of these items in the temple really signify things that we receive from God. And the menorah is symbolic of, of illumination, of wisdom. Actually, when we look at the temple, at the menorah that was in the temple, which is covered in almonds and pomegranates, when we read the Torah's description of the menorah, very clearly we see it's not a regular menorah. It's covered in flowers and pomegranates and almonds and so forth. And really what it is it's a tree that's intended to resemble the tree of knowledge from the Garden of Eden. And the tree even to this day, right, when someone has an idea in a comic, a light bulb goes on. There's an idea of light being connected to wisdom, to knowledge. And similarly in Jewish tradition, light is connected with an idea of wisdom, of knowledge of God. And this is sort of the idea of this prophecy of Zechariah. And this kind of goes on in Talmud that actually right here, I'll just bring it here. This question comes up about, which is more important if you only have enough money, someone who's poor, and only has to make a decision between lights for Shabbat candles, oil to light Shabbat candles, or oil for a Hanukkah menorah, which should they use? Now, the oil, the light of Hanukkah is symbolic, right? You're actually not allowed to use the Hanukkah candles for light. You can't turn off all the lights and light the Hanukkah candles and then read by them, things like that. Because the light of the Hanukkah candles, like the light of the menorah in the temple, is symbolic. It's intended to remind us of sort of our faith, of the wisdom that we receive from God. And this, though, is different than the Shabbat candles, which are intended to be practical. We're supposed to use them for light, to see. And so the question comes, if you have to decide between using a Shabbat candle or Hanukkah candles, which should you use? And it says the Shabbat lamp takes precedence because of peace in the home, of Shalom Bayit. Without the light of the Shabbat candles, people would be sitting and eating their meal in the dark, right? Very practical. Hanukkah candles, you can't utilize their light. Shabbat candles, you're supposed to use their light. And so if you have to decide between the two, Shabbat candles take precedence. But later on, it says, Rav Huna said, one who's accustomed to kindle lights on Shabbat and Hanukkah will be rewarded and have children who are Torah scholars who will disseminate the light of Torah. So I wanted to touch on that latter piece because it brings in this idea of the Hanukkah candles being related to sort of the light of Torah, the light of wisdom. And this is different than the light of Shabbat, which is the light of peace in the home, of Shalom Bayit. It's allowing people to sit around the table and see each other. And what Rav Huna is saying is they're both really important. Having Shalom Bayit, having peace in the house, having everyone able to see is really important. The light of the Hanukkah candles, the symbolic light, which reminds us of of God, of wisdom, is also really important, and it connects with, it says if you light both, you'll have children who are Torah scholars, who have sort of suffused their lives with both of these lights, the light of Shabbat, of peace in the home, and the light of tradition, of wisdom. But if you need to pick one or the other, we pick the light of Shabbat. We pick this light of Shalom Bayit, of peace in the home, over the light of Hanukkah, the symbolic light of wisdom. Now, why do you think that is? That we would prefer, practical light that allows you to see over the symbolic light of, reminding us of God.
Well, isn't Shabbat considered the most important holiday?
Shabbat is considered the most important holiday. Yeah, it is. And I think there's something about Shabbat, of a time of being around family, around other people, right? Even the idea of Shabbat candles, back in the day when people didn't have electricity, they needed these candles to see. And it's saying Shabbat isn't supposed to be a time of just being away from other people. There's an importance of being able to see each other, to spend time together. That's really central.
I would think that it's also, um, when you said peace in the home, um, especially if you have children that need to be attended to, food that needs to be served, order that needs to be brought in after meals, and all of that. It's just the practical side of a family at peace and have
Mm-hmm.
a peaceful environment. I can't even imagine trying to serve my husband, my family, my children in the dark.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
So I think that practical, um, and I've always thought that God was probably a lot more practical than we ever give him credit.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's almost like it's and the Hanukkah candles. I light mine year round for whatever bothers me or when I feel like I need to get in touch with God on a special
Hmm.
thought. I'll light those Hanukkah candles, and my children have gotten to where they'll tell me, "Mama, light your candles. We got something going on here," you know?
Really?
Yeah. So that's the way I've connected it. It's not just for Christmas or whatever. It's when my heart is heavy or my mind is burdened. There's something about lighting those candles, going to bed. I get up in the morning, they're gone. I've already talked that out with God. That's done. I can move on.
That's
That's
beautiful.
beautiful.
That's just
Yeah,
my idea.
that's beautiful. I love that, and that really is the idea of the Hanukkah candles. Is right a sort of a reminder of God, a reminder of God's, illumination, and wisdom that God gives to us. And you're right. It doesn't need to just be. I mean, we only have a commandment. We only say a blessing on lighting them, the Hanukkah candles during Hanukkah. But there's actually a tradition that people have of um, sitting around the Hanukkah candles and sort of basking in its light, even though we don't use the light, like I said, for practical purposes. We don't light Hanukkah candles so we can see, but people will sit around them and just kind of watch the light because it, like you said, it's that way of sort of enables this communication with God, a reminder of God, in the way that you brought, which I think is really beautiful. And yet, peace in the home, shalom bayit, takes precedence. And by the way, I think this touches on the questions with which we started on why is it that we downplay the military victory? I mentioned that the military victory is not Jews against Greeks, it's Jews against Jews. It's a civil war. It's a war in our own households, as it were. And I think that's a big part of the reason why the rabbis were so uncomfortable with focusing on the military piece, because it's a reminder of civil strife. It's a reminder of a time when there wasn't shalom bayit,
Hmm.
when there wasn't this peace in the home. And the more we celebrate, defeating factions within our people, the more factionalism is likely to come forward within our people. And so I think that was a very conscious decision that the Talmud makes to say, you know what, we're not going to talk about defeating the Jews who wanted to practice like Greeks. We're not going to, we don't want to focus on this strife in the home. We want to focus on peace in the home. And the miracle of the oil, of the light that lasts 8 days, is not something that serves to divide us from one another. It's something that's we can all get behind. Even those people who are on the other side of the military victory, who sort of preferred to worship the Greek gods and observe Greek ways, are not going to feel personally, affronted by the miracle of the oil lasting for 8 days. And so this idea that the Talmud brings in its conversation about Hanukkah of focusing on Shabbat candles over Hanukkah candles is kind of a reminder that peace in the home takes precedence over virtually all, and as much as the light of God, the light of the symbolic light of the Hanukkah candles is important, we don't want that to overpower the light of Shabbat, the light which represents peace. And the great Rabbi Maimonides, writing about 11th century, sort of takes this idea from the Talmud and brings it even just a little bit further, saying that if a poor person must choose between Shabbat lights and Hanukkah lights, or between Shabbat lights and wine for Kiddush, the lighting of his home takes priority so as to sustain peace in the house, since even the divine name was erased to make peace between a husband and his wife. That, by the way, is a reference to the Sota ritual, which we don't have to get into, but this idea that even God's name can be erased for peace. There's a great story in actually just a couple Torah portions ago where God actually lies a little bit. When Sarah says to God, when God tells Sarah that she's going to have a child, or the angels, who are sent by God, tell Sarah that she's going to have a child, and she said, "How can I have a child? I'm so old and my husband is so old." And when those angels then go and pass that message along to Abraham, they leave out that Sarah said that her husband was so old. And the rabbis say, this demonstrates how focused God is on peace, that even God's angels talking to Abraham told a little bit of a white lie, not mentioning that his wife said, "My husband is so old," because that would cause a loss of peace in the home. Right? And Maimonides concludes this chapter saying, "Great is peace, since the entire Torah has been given to create peace in the world. As it is written in Proverbs, its ways are ways of pleasantness, and all its paths are peace." And so I think that kind of brings together this idea we started with, of how Hanukkah was transformed, honestly, from its origins as what it seemed to be a kind of a populist holiday that was not initially inaugurated by the rabbis as an annual event. It seemed to, from reading the Book of Maccabees, it seems that it was something that the populace brought up as a reminder of this military victory, and the rabbis, when they took it, they transformed it, because they said, we don't want to focus on that lack of shalom, that lack of peace. We want to, we'll hold on to the holiday. We'll transform it into a way where it's about peace. It's about wisdom. It's about connection with God, but it's not about defeating our enemies. Because especially when our enemies are our own brothers, our own sisters, in this way it can be a holiday that serves to unify us rather than kind of tearing us apart from one another. Okay, Phyllis, I saw your hand is raised on here, but you're muted.
Did you do that on purpose?
Was that on purpose that you raised your hand, Phyllis? Or was that accidental?
You're muted, so we can't hear you. There you go.
Okay,
Yes.
now,
Yes.
now I'm okay.
Okay, you didn't.
Checking on her because she was so quiet and we couldn't see her face. Checking on her.
Yeah.
It's not used to me being quiet.
I don't know. It is a little bit different being, in person versus on the street. It's sort of a different feeling. But okay. So any other questions or comments on this approach to Hanukkah, which might be, perhaps gives a little bit of insights into how Hanukkah became the holiday as we celebrate it today.
I really liked it. I didn't know the stories that went with it or any of that, but now it's really been, I love the study of history, just love it. And now I have the history of the Hanukkah, which makes it even, I don't know, more special to me, when I with my children. Because the two themes I walk away with is that my idea of connecting with God and the Hanukkah was perfect.
Oh, yeah.
The idea of the practicality of peace in my home should always be paramount.
Absolutely. And I think, that's often is a struggle of, what Hanukkah in some ways represents, even though we like Hanukkah, it really is a holiday in some ways about zealotry. Right? It's about, killing other Jews for the sake of God, which is, you know, not the simplest message. And this way, it's, you know, like I said, it's really about, you know, we take it from that and we say, no, let's make it about, you know, about connection with God. And connection with God doesn't need to mean defeating others. It can be just about our own personal connections with God.
Wow, what a world we'd have if everyone believed that. What
Yeah,
wouldn't be
yeah,
this situation, I don't think.
absolutely.
Yeah, if we could all come from that and let others be as they
Absolutely.
are. Hmm.
Absolutely.
I know when I was growing up, my dad, who had been very religious when he was young, and that used to say that Hanukkah was just a means to equal the Christian Christmas. And really, that's how people are using it. It's not for a Jewish holiday, it's an anti-Christian holiday.
Yes, I think that's accurate. I think that, you know, it became a very much a response, you know, to
Mhm.
Hanukkah, and people said, oh well, you know, if they're going to have Christmas trees out in public, let's put our menorahs out in public. There are a number of big cases about that, big court cases.
Yeah,
Actually, Chabad, who we brought in before, was big on that. That when other, you know, back in the day, it used to be that the Jews were saying, you know, there's a, you know, separation of church and state. We shouldn't have Christmas trees and Christmas lights and things like that out in public. And Chabad, who we talked about before, actually took the other side. They said, no, rather than pushing their symbols out of the public space, we should be pushing our symbols into the public space. And we can have Christmas trees, that's fine, but we should also have menorahs and have big public menorah lightings, which
They
I
Chabad
do.
think
everywhere has. Right? And
a
they said
lot of
it's right. And they said
I
it's
think
not
a
about
lot of
hiding
people feel
religion from the
that way
public space.
now too, because all you see on TV are all the Christmas trees. And now some of the stations are getting wiser and putting in a menorah or on next to the tree. The tree is immense, 6 feet. The menorah is 6 inches.
Right, right.
But it made it on. It made it on.
But it made it on, and that, right, and that's sort of one of an interesting change in recent decades is, you know, the way that Hanukkah and its symbols, again, even though it's not by any stretch of the imagination, you know, the biggest Jewish holiday, has sort of become that way. And, you know, with that being said, though, it's not a holiday that has sort of no depth to it. You know, there is a story, there are multiple stories about what Hanukkah is, and there is this message
better.
that, you know, right, there is a deeper message of Hanukkah, even if the way that it's typically commemorated is just about gifts and, you know, candles and things like that. You
Eating
know,
lots of good fried food.
and lots of good fried food. Yeah, exactly.
Well,
Yeah.
I think a lot of the things that we do are the result of trying to be different. Because he had told me that originally, like in shul, the men would go bareheaded, but then the Christians did it, so they put on hats. They would kneel. Christians did it, so they stand.
Yeah.
It's all, it's like a reverse psychology.
Yeah, I think that's true. There's certainly a lot of ways in which, you know, people do things to demonstrate they're different. And by the way, that's the story of Hanukkah, right? The story of Hanukkah is everyone was becoming assimilated and observing Greek ways, and these people said, no, we're not going to do it, right? So it's actually kind of appropriate in an ironic way that Hanukkah, I think more than any other story, is about maintaining your separate identity in the face of kind of overwhelming assimilation and, you know, the prevalence of other cultures. So it actually, strangely, is kind of appropriate in the way we celebrate it.